Clapper board. You're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled Just One Night with Me. She offered her daughter for a blanket, but a human took them home instead. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. The ash fell in slow, sifting curtains, like the planet itself had decided to snow its own memory. It gathered in the angles of collapsed towers and drifted through the rib cages of bridges that no longer reached anything. In the distance, always the distance, storms wandered on metal legs over a flat horizon, the color of old grief. Far above, the sky was choked with a halo of wreckage, a halo the war had hammered around Dalen 4 like a crown of thorns. Elias Varon moved through the ruins with the careful patience of someone who knew the world had traps in it, some laid by enemies, most laid by chance. His visor threw quiet numbers at the edges of his vision: wind chill, static load, particulate density. He'd long ago stopped reading them, but the comfort of seeing them tick on was its own kind of food. He was a scar wrapped in a thermal cloak, a steady breath in a frozen city, a human shape that kept choosing forward long after forward had stopped making sense. On the second day of the Black Gale, he saw the fire, no bigger than a lantern and nearly as shy, cradled under the fractured lip of a transport concourse. At first it was just that, a color different from the world. Then, as he drew closer, he saw them. The mother was crouched nearest the coals, blue-gray skin drawn tight enough to show the angles of hunger, eyes too large in a face used to plenty. The child, little more than a threadbare shadow, curled against her flank, teeth knocking time in her head. He slowed. He did not raise his hands. He did not call out. There was a rhythm to these meetings on dead worlds. Move too fast, you scatter the last trust. Speak too loud, you wake the sleeping guns. The mother saw him and flinched. She rose and placed herself between the human and the child, though she had nothing left to threaten with but bones and desperation. Her voice scraped through a translator so old it stuttered pronouns. Please, please, just one night, the heat. My daughter is if you for the blanket. The words faltered like a body that had simply run out of steps. Her hands shook as she reached behind her, hauled the child forward, and committed her desperation to a terrible bargain. You can have her, just one night. Let her lie warm. Elias stopped within a pace of the fire. The embers breathed in the wind as if uncertain whether life was a kindness. The child's eyes were huge, reflective, empty the way a glass shell is empty, bereft of the thing that used to sing inside it. He let his own breath fog and unfog again until the animal panic in the air eased a notch. Keep your daughter, he said, and unpinned the thermal from his shoulders. He wrapped it around both of them like a pledge. His hands were slow, visible the way you move for a wounded dog. Stay warm. When this breaks, we'll find better shelter. The mother blinked hard once, twice, like a machine trying to cycle a function it had never known how to perform. Her species didn't cry, but something cracked in her face anyway. The body will attempt a ritual even when it doesn't possess the tools. You give it freely. Not freely, he said, and crouched to feed the fire careful scraps of composite and carbon mesh that knew how to burn without smoking. I'd like you both to keep breathing. That's my price. The translator hiccuped, searching, and then, thank you. Her name, he learned later, was Sale. The child's was Lyra, 3 syllables between them and a whole sky of ruin. They ate what he had, one protein sheet divided into 3 uneven squares, the largest pressed insistently into the child's hands. The storm rattled the concourse bones, snowed ash into patterns that pretended at beauty when the light shifted. Elias kept glancing at the upper reaches of the shattered hub, not because he expected anything to move there, but because old habit insisted on naming perches where snipers could lie, even on worlds where all the snipers were gone. Where will you go? He asked when they'd swallowed what they could, and the guilt of finishing was no longer worse than the hunger. Sail's gaze went east, to where a smudge of cranes clawed the horizon. "Shelters," she said. "Before the burning, they say the ground there still glows." The translator was better now, warmed by the heat of living bodies. "There's an old guard bunker north by northeast," Elias said. "Forward command. If it's not glass inside, it's steel. If power's still buried down there, we can steal a little civilization back." Sail's eyes tipped to the cloak around her shoulders. "You would take us with you." "No one survives alone," he said. He did not say not anymore. He did not need to. They moved at break of gray. The city received them with the dull politeness of a place too tired to hate. Above, the sky peeled into a thin brightness that wasn't sun exactly, but did enough to keep the world from being only one color. They walked through avenues lined in facades that had learned to stand without their insides, and past statues whose heroics made no sense to the dead on the ground. A transport lay on its side like a whale, ribs torn open, snowing wires and regret. They passed a courtyard where the wind had uncovered the arc of bodies left where the blast had dropped them. Sail tucked Lyra's face into the blanket, but the child looked anyway because you look when you are trying to understand the mask the world has chosen. "Why?" she asked, voice small and unprocessed by a translator, and something in Elias recoiled at how universal that word was, how same in every throat he'd heard it from. "Because they forgot," he said, plain. "Forgot the cost, forgot the names. Forgot that breath is the only currency that ever buys anything true." Lyra nodded like someone memorizing rules for a game she didn't intend to play. Small hands tightened in the knit. Elias moved them on. In an industrial corridor where the buildings leaned into each other for warmth and failed to find it, they heard the first drone. It came as a vibration through the ground, as if something large and patient were drumming somewhere far away. Elias's visor glitched, then presented a red skein of dots to the west. He could have cursed any number of gods for letting the Karth Dominion decide this world had not been cleansed with sufficient thoroughness the first time. But gods weren't reading his file and he had work. He pulled them under a collapsed overpass, found the seam in the earth where a mag-train tunnel had bitten so deep even the orbital fires had only licked it. The drones passed the first time like a storm of eyes, beams combing the ruinous skin of the city with a hunger that had never learned to be full. One paused, one swung. The child's heat signature kicked like a trapped bird under the blanket, and Elias moved. A single upward slide, rifle cradled like a memory he did not love. One controlled pulse into the shining center of a machine that did not receive his apology. It fell like a dying thought. The others turned toward the noise as one. A different kind of weather arrived. They ran. Running rearranged the world. It simplified it into breadth and angle, and whether you had the right speed at the right time to pass through the thin places fate sometimes left. Energy bolts spanged off old steel and churned the ash into frantic ghosts. Elias's shoulder received a glancing ion wash that numbed it from neck to bicep. He marked it, argued his hand into holding the rifle anyway. They dove down the throat of the train tunnel, and the world above went on burning with no one in it who mattered to them. He set charges in the throat of the access shaft 100 meters in and waited. The first wave of drones poured through the opening with the implacable politeness of a bureaucracy. He thumbed ignition and taught them a brief course in the physics of overpressure. The tunnel coughed the metal aside and swallowed the ash that came to investigate. After a time, the surface remembered it was a surface and carried on doing its job. In the low blue quiet, Lyra trembled too hard to pretend. Sail pressed her face to the child's temple and let the blanket do work it had not been designed for. Elias's shoulder made a choice to bleed. Sail made another to stop it. She tore strips from what was left of her sleeves and bound in the way of people who have seen wounds and refused to say a prayer over them. "You are hurt," she said. "It has me," he said, but not in any way that matters while you look at me, so I consider us all lucky. The tunnel took them like a river after that, carrying them beneath districts that had names once and now had only coordinates. They slept in a service alcove the size of a small lie. Somewhere far overhead, machines hunted things that wanted to be people. Elias woke every hour and listened to the way the earth breathed. He did not dream about his unit by name anymore. His mind had learned that trick to let him keep moving. By the third day, the tunnel climbed toward a slice of light. Beyond it, clean and absurd as a myth, a plane of glass lay shining under an honest sun. It was not alive, but it wasn't trying to kill them either, and that felt like a fresh invention. Elias took them north by east, the bunker's location living the way coordinates live in a soldier's bones, tucked next to 100 other things that used to be true. The bunker announced itself long before it arrived. The earth rose subtly, the way a muscle tenses. The ground grew stubborn. The ash thinned as if even the ruin was wary of a place that had been built to say no. They found the blast doors half buried under windwork and doctrine. Elias knelt and brushed the emblem free of grit. A half-faded sigil, a hand holding a torch amid a ring of stars. It used to move something in him. Now it just calibrated the century he lived inside. The doors did not want to open. He did not want to be polite about it. He set his shoulder against cold steel and listened for compromise. In the end, physics negotiated what politics could not. The doors complained until they admitted they had lost. Inside, the air was the complicated cold of old machines. Lights blinked to prove that something had endured here even if no one had asked it to. The floors held dust, and the shapes of boots that had last been there before the planet above had learned what it was to be glass. Sale's hand moved to Lyra's shoulder as if pulled by a magnet. Elias's eyes moved without asking permission to corners his training had put a circle around. Not ghosts, exactly. More like the shadows of the assumptions you carry into a room. Insignia still hung in the command chamber. The table was real metal, and at its center a projection plate waited for a hand that would never call it by its given name again. Elias touched it anyway. It awoke like an old dog, startled but pleased. The power grid was a patient thing. He followed its quiet from panel to panel, burdened by none of the derision a younger man might have held for the way older men had done their work. He rewired 3 cut loops, stole a fuse from a medical bay that would not mind, and whispered the correct sequence of lies soldiers teach their infrastructure to get cooperation. 70% of the bunker remembered how to be itself. It was enough to impersonate civilization. It was also enough to make noise any hunter on the planet could hear. He turned the transmitter on last because he wanted that moment to matter. Across the boards, lights pulled themselves into the trick of being a net. Frequencies flowered like small, careful dawns. He did not even need to speak to know where the voice would land. Among the rag hooks and quiet satellites and the old bones of networks that crisscrossed a war and refused to dissolve even when everything else did. He recorded it anyway, because people put a face to words differently when the sound is there. This is Elias Varon, Sergeant, Human Expeditionary Guard. Bunker Tier 4, Grid 47 North by 12 East, Dalen 4. 2 survivors at minimum, 1 child. Shelter, power, food sufficient for short term. If you're human, tell me who you are. If you're someone else, come here and learn to be gentle. Static answered at first, which was not a refusal you could take personally. Then days later, after rationing that asked too much of 3 stomachs and maintenance that asked too much of 1 set of hands, something more complicated threaded the air. It was not a voice. It was the thud of big ships opening their throats in the atmosphere, heavy as heaven falling. He felt it in his teeth before the bunker's old bones began to vibrate. "Karth," he said. It could have been anyone on a day like this, but there was a particular arrogance to the way the landing vectors carved the sound out of the sky, as if they owned the right to open the air. The Dominion had come back to certify their victory. Sale's eyes widened. She had made her peace with many deaths, but the thought of one chosen by a timetable angered her. They found us. They found something, Elias said. Us or a rumor or a noise. We never expected to be the only story on this world. He checked the perimeter feeds. Dots grew fatter like raindrops magnifying the pond. Infantry, drones, walkers. The word walker had a way of cooling a room. Walkers were not proud machines, but they were determined ones, a cathedral of joints and murder with the kind of math you didn't persuade. Lower levels, Elias said. Reinforced hatch. Lyra, take your mother. Close it when you get there. Sale shook her head. She had kept a child warm with a handful of coals. She had torn her own clothes to stop a human's bleeding. She had stared at a field of bodies and not let the universe draft her into its logic. She did not shake it because she disagreed. She shook it because certain muscles had learned to say no and could not help it. You cannot hold them. I can make them wonder if they will get to keep what they think they already own, he said. Sometimes wondering is enough. He placed a hand briefly on Lyra's hair, which had the brittle texture of starving days. You asked me if humans get scared, he told her. We do. It is not disqualifying. He smiled with only half a mouth because the other half had learned not to lie. Go on. He barricaded the first approach with crates that had once held med gel and now held the weight of the room's hope. He seeded the tunnel with the last of his charges. He earthed the relay in the comm center so any energy spike would go into the bunker's bones instead of the systems that would keep the air moving across 3 throats. When the first drones arrived, they came on the lower bay, where a human mind had expected them, and so a human mind had taken that expectation and laced it with insult. The shockwave shoved them back into their own legs. For a moment, the dust and light pretended to be a sunrise, which was the kind of joke humans like to tell themselves right before the worst part of the day. Drones became infantry. Infantry became the rattle of rifles loud enough to pace the bunker's walls with echoes. Elias merely shifted from one angle to another like a chess piece that only advanced diagonally because history had decreed it, and laid down fire until he had to trade patience for invention. He bled, yes. He counted it and pocketed it and did not spend it on theatrics. He used the names of his dead to pace himself. One measured breath to each, and learned once more how much endurance can be made out of syllables if you mean them while you breathe. Then the earth gave one of those simple warnings you don't mistake, the thudding step of something that the ground itself had not agreed to carry, but did so anyway out of politeness. The walker hauled itself into view like the future's bad mood. It was all legs and center mass and red eyes, and the promise of flattening anything that said no in a voice it didn't respect. Elias reloaded and found that this felt, perversely, like relief. He did not want to play at attrition in hallways. He wanted to step under a falling thing and see which of them hit harder. The first shot from the walker's main turned the doorway into a bright memory. The bunker's front teeth went skittering across the floor. Elias's shield pack told him a number it didn't mean to be a joke. He accepted that it had done enough and let it die. He ran. He was very good at running toward the wrong thing. Under the walker's jutting belly, there was a notch where the axis of 2 pieces of armor did not kiss quite right. The machine had a secret even it didn't value. He slid an ash and fired 3 rounds in a triangle that a teacher had once insisted on. Metal screamed the way metal does when made to do something it had not imagined in its design brief. He jammed the last explosive he had into the hole he'd made and rolled like a coin tossed in prayer. He did not see the light. He felt the pressure like a god's hand on his chest, and woke later under a peeled section of wall where dust filtered into shafts of late-day sun too tender for a scene like this. He dragged himself out of the rubble, shook free a laugh because the lungs wanted one more honest thing. In the upper corridor, the world was quiet, as if the planet itself was leaning down to hear if this trick apes from a blue world would run it again. He crawled down to the lower levels. Sail stood at the hatch with Lyra crammed behind her legs, both of them wild-eyed the way you get when the math begins to work again in your favor and you don't trust it yet. "You lived," Sail said, and it was not disbelief. It was ceremony. You said it the way you invoke a thing that has chosen to keep visiting. "The walker didn't," he said. He tried to make that into humor and then remembered that he had only ever been good at humor with people who already knew how to hold it. "They inventoried the bunker the way you inventory a heart's remaining beats. Food, some. Water, purifiable, which is another word for possible. Power, partial, but enough to be coaxed one more time into dignity. Ammo, obscene in its honesty. They slept. Sleep did not accept the invitation, but it sat in a chair by the bed and watched over them. Elias woke to the sound of Sail humming an old migration song into Lyra's hair. Its steps were uneven and true. He remembered someone once singing into his skull as if the head itself were a bowl that could catch a sound and keep it from hitting the floor. On the 5th day, a human voice that had not been manufactured inside the bunker made a choice to reach them. It came like a raveling, threads pulled from static into a braid that could hold weight. N4 repeat Dalen 4 receive distress call. This is Frigate Kestrel of the 3rd Repatriation Fleet. Identify, if friendly, flare on transponder 15. Sit tight, do not break cover, we have contested air. Sail looked at him, neck straightening as if someone had installed a mast inside it. "They are coming. If they are saying it, they're willing to try," Elias said. He could hear the note in the voice that said the operator had slept on a floor with their boots on because the past would not let the present love them otherwise. He toggled the transponder, threw the flare in math, not color. He answered and did not say any names. No one needed those now. The day would be busy enough. The Kestrel found a slot in the sky where the Dominion patrols didn't have enough eyes. It squatted over the bunker like a mother bird humorlessly pretending to be a rock. Its belly opened in an eerie-eyed promise. Ropes dropped and riggers slid down them like the poem of gravity done with vigor. They smelled like oil and salt, the old shamelessness of ships. "3 up," shouted a woman with a shaved head and a face that had chosen calm as a profession. She offered Sail a harness and Lyra a smile whose gentleness had been paid for dear. "You're human," Sail said, wonder layered with the irritation of someone annoyed that wonder has taken this long to arrive in the world. The woman grinned, feral for a second. "We get that a lot." Elias stepped back. He had practiced this in his head and now he made his body submit. "They go," he said, and his voice didn't crack because it had been briefed. "I stay." Sail's face did a number of things in an instant and then chose one that involved his shoulders and insistence. "No, you said no one survives alone. That was the vow." "You won't be," he said. "You will be with people who can teach Lyra to be loud again." He looked up past the ribs of the ship and found the sky beyond it. "And someone has to make sure any latecomers don't try to sleep in the open with a storm like that coming. There are always latecomers." He let his mouth bend. "And there are ghosts here that get bored when left without supervision." Lyra hugged him. Children learn to perform ceremonies faster than adults because their hearts are made of it. Her arms felt like a future insisting. "You said you don't do this alone," she said into his ribs. "I don't," he agreed. "Listen." He tapped a knuckle against the bunker's wall, the old concrete answering with a low, satisfied sound. "Place and duty, noise and memory. I will be noisy on your behalf." He saw the way Sail hovered and made the necessary physical gesture. A touch to her forehead the way her people did when requesting permission from the old gods to enter a home. It let her step back with dignity when nothing else would have. They rose in a wind the planet had forgotten it could make. A cable dragged against the bunker's lip with a sound like the clatter of trophies. Sail's gaze stayed on him until the hatch took her. Then the ship's belly had them, and the sky took the ship, and the Dominion threw a tantrum too late to be anything but noise. He did not pretend this did not hurt. He held it and let it breathe until it was a citizen of his body and not an invader. He reset the perimeter. He fixed the door the walker had tried to make into a thesis. He stitched his shoulder. He made tea of hot water and a memory of leaves a medic had once smuggled under a bed and shared at a price paid in stories. He drank it like the kind of man who knew exactly what price those stories required. The repatriation fleet did not leave the world to the wolves. They came back with bigger ships and better lies, the sort of lies you use to encourage stubborn survivors to live one kind of day instead of falling into another kind. They left caches and sensors that gave the world something to say besides screaming. Elias fed coordinates into systems that had remembered how to hand them back with a flourish. He became the person you contacted when you wanted to tuck a family into the earth properly. Stories got out. They get out faster than anything because there is no friction they won't learn to laugh at. On a listening post under a gray dwarf, a technician cried noiselessly into a mug she'd been warming for an hour because someone told her about a blanket. On a refueling station hung like a pendant under a gas giant's pink throat, a scow captain with too much iron in his blood put down his cup and stared out at the static as if it would give him his mother back. In a human camp on a moon that didn't have the decency to be warm, a girl used Lyra's name like a spell to go to sleep with. The message moved through the networks like a contagion engineered by compassion. He gave them his blanket. He gave them his home. He gave them hope. More than once, ships came in hot with a trail of Dominion attention like a jealous lover. Elias's bunker had to pretend to be dead, then pretend to be granite, then pretend to be a poor investment. He learned all the ways a place refuses to be a target and taught them again. He beat back drones with the patience of an old fisherman flicking eels off a net. He disassembled a second walker with the same triangle of shots because geometry, unlike empires, remembers its obligations. Between alarms, he tried to repair a garden. It was a joke and a prayer. 3 boxes salvaged from storage, filled with soil that might have remembered. He dug with hands that were not meant for planting and taught them anyway. He made a rig of water lines out of hose that would have preferred to die as conduit. He coaxed seeds from a packet someone had thought to leave because humanity's arrogance is sometimes to assume there will be a future. They did not sprout that first month, but the act of putting them in the dirt punctured something in the dread. A future could be a piece of plastic with pictures of leaves on it. A future could be a man standing over a trough, saying, "Come on then," to things that had no ears. Sometimes he stepped above ground at dawn. The glass planes caught the morning and returned it like a coin, cheap and beautiful. There were days when the wind arranged the ash into something like lines of writing. He read it as if the planet were obliging his loneliness. It said nothing. He answered out loud anyway because you should meet quiet with a voice or it will convert you. Weeks made themselves into months through the brute labor of sunsets. The fleet built things that could be called towns if you were generous and had a good imagination for roofs. Sail sent a message when that became possible. The translator softened her consonants with an affection it had learned. "We are under a sky that is rude with stars," she said. Lyra laughed in the background and the sound went longer than his body could hold. "She is learning to run toward music. We planted a food vine. It is argumentative, but we will win. Come see us when you decide you have supervised enough ghosts." "Your food vine will be a tyrant if you let it," he said. He swallowed the way a man does when a thing more tender than water tries to pass down a throat trained for ration bars. "I will come. After this season. After the ice stops making all the decisions." Dominion raids changed their shape as all oppressions do when confronted with a schedule. It made them brittle sometimes, which is the only thing brittleness ever does. Elias learned to break raids as if they were bad habits. In every battle, he did not throw the first punch. He simply rejected the last. It was enough to make him an appointment in the minds of those who had to file intelligence on why Dalen IV refused to lie down. His name began to knock around the inside of their briefings like a stone inside a can. Humanity's trick of turning a man into a story, and a story into a strategy, had always irritated empires. On a gray afternoon where the air tasted of iron, one of the planet's old moods, he walked the bunker's halls as if they were simply halls and not sermons. He paused in the command chamber and looked at the etching he had carved with the point of a broken chassis a year ago. 4 words. He had not overthought them because he had not had time. No one survives alone. He touched the grooves, rough under his finger like bark. The room held his breath and returned it. Outside, a thunderhead rolled, deciding whether it liked the way the glass planes used to reflect it. Inside the comm stack, something squealed once and died heroically. He replaced it. He checked the batteries like a man who knew the worship of small things kept big ones from devouring him. And then, with the insolence of good timing, the universe sent him proof that all the waiting had been a form of work. The fleet came not as raiders but as builders. Not just Kestrel, but her sisters. The sky filled with the bellies of ships that had learned to land with gentleness. Out past the glass, towers rose on legs that promised floors and beds and a place for the world to put its various elbows. The Dominion tried at petness and got swatted as one swats insects, with the improbable grace of a giant who has learned to thread needles. He went because they asked. Finally and properly, he found sail where the new settlement leaned into a hill that had forgiven the planet enough to be grass again in a single brave blade. Lyra ran with other children, her legs as sure as if the ground had been made for them. Sail hugged him like you hug someone who made the winter bearable, which is to say she put the lie to it but respected its teeth. They sat on boxes that would one day be tables and ate from a bowl that had a chip and a future. "The blanket?" Sail asked, glancing at his shoulder as if the knit should be there. "We kept it," she said before he could answer. "We wash it too often and we refuse to stop. Lyra uses it when she cannot sleep. It is an argument with the night." She looked out a line of saplings trying to pretend they had always intended to be trees. "They tell your story on the ships," she said. "I've heard it sung badly and told beautifully and cried through by men who do not weep unless someone else starts. Sometimes it is yours exactly. Sometimes it is something else entirely. I thought you should know." "I like the badly sung ones," Elias said. "They are honest about the key they do not have." She smiled. "He gave them his blanket," she said. "He gave them his home. He gave them hope. It keeps changing and it is always that." He stayed that time for a month. He taught a small class on how to listen to a horizon. He showed a boy how to repair a valve with his hands and a curse. And the boy's father shook his hand afterward like they had trafficked in prayers. He held Lyra's hand as she stood on something high for the first time and didn't look down. He sat up alone in the dark and allowed himself to let the future put a chair at the table without insisting on credentials. When he returned to the bunker, because he had to, duty and place, and because not everyone who loved a story gets to keep its subject, he found someone had cut a neat rectangle out of the wall next to his 4 words and set a plaque there with a care that embarrassed him. It said only this: Elias Varon kept the doors open. That was better than heroics. He let it stand because he understood the economy of symbols, and he also understood the indulgence of telling an old soldier he would be permitted to leave the room whenever he chose. The planet took a breath. The ash found other ways to be pretty. Kids made a game of seeing who could run across the glass flats without falling and learning an inconvenient lesson about friction. Women argued politics, and then compromised because someone had brought soup, and it is difficult to be self-righteous with a spoon in your mouth. Men wept on the first sunny afternoon of a new season and called it sweat. Somewhere a food vine decided to be magnanimous and shared in a way that made last winter look like a rumor. The Dominion tried one more time. It came as so many endings do, not as a catastrophe, but as a procedure. An officer with a neat mouth and a file full of assumptions brought a strike package and tried to apply paperwork to a planet. It went badly, not because humanity outgunned them, though it tried, but because the procedure did not include an entry for what people who have made a place out of ruins become when you try to take it from them. It did not include how 100 small skills add to something like weather. It did not include telling a story in the dark until the dark quits. Elias did his part. It was not dramatic enough to make the songs. He rerouted pumps so that the fire didn't suffocate them. He shot the exact right hinge off a gate that otherwise would have let the wrong people in at the wrong moment. He said, "Hold," a number of times, and once, carefully, in the exact right voice, he said, "Go." He reminded a young officer with a good heart of the most useful thing an elder can say to anyone who has chosen to stand in a door. You do not have to become stone. You just have to learn how to lean. When the last Karth gunship made the tactical decision to call its mother and confess it had misread the room, the planet made a sound you had to be very quiet to hear. It was not victory. It was relief putting down its bags. Elias stood under a sky that had finally remembered blue without assistance and let himself think of blankets the way a man thinks of bridges, not salvation but the means. He went to the city once more, because some corners of him liked to check the locks. The concourse was still there, still chewed, still hunching its shoulders against a wind that had gotten mean out of habit. He found the place where a small, ridiculous fire had dared to argue with a storm. He stood in it and smiled. The ash bears footprints for a minute and then it does not. He made some anyway and watched them disappear. He felt lighter every time a gust erased one. On a wall, because there is always a wall, he carved another line with the broken chassis point he kept in a pocket for use against hubris. He did not set it next to the first. He put it where someone might look when the old one had stopped being a start. It said, "Be kind first. The rest is engineering." When the repatriation fleet finally called Dalen for something like safe, not a guarantee, never that, but a promise that had learned how to fulfill itself, Elias wrote a message to Sale and did not send it, because some things are better told on foot. He started walking. There were 3 blankets in his pack, one old, one new, one he had found in an empty house that smelled like someone who had laughed in the kitchen. He meant to give all 3 away and arrive with his shoulders cold and his heart busy. The trail ran him past places where the city had remembered its bones. He stepped through a skeleton of a school and found a chalkboard with a word on it that could have meant anything. A child's joke, a last lesson, a teacher's name. He touched it. Chalk got on his fingers and turned him into a man who could leave prints on things that were going to be seen. It moved him more than was sensible, which was why he let it. Dignity had never been humanity's greatest trick. Feeling had built more bridges than pride. He arrived at the settlement on an evening when all the weather decided to show up at once. Rose light and a wind with a story to tell, and a sky full of cloud like a woman's skirt about to be caught on something and laugh about it. Lyra ran like prophecy. Sale stood with her hands on her hips and her mouth full of satisfaction because something she had been willing had happened, and she was the sort to take credit even when she knew better. He handed them the blankets. They mocked him for the ritual of it and swaddled him in affection, which he submitted to like a man who had learned that there are losses you get to choose. They ate under a canvas someone swore wasn't level and everyone else pretended was. He told a small story. They told a large one. Children made a game of the walker angle under tables using their hands and spoons. The old men got a little drunk and congratulated each other on surviving old age, which is something like surviving a war but with more witnesses. A woman sang a song that was not good and everyone was grateful for it. As the evening unspooled into the sort of night that makes you forgive a planet for all its other moods, Sale pressed his hand and said, "If you decide you are done being the person everyone leaves messages for in the dark, we have a door." "I have many rooms," he said softly, not because he believed in safety, but because he had learned confidence in places. "Then pick any," she said. "You built most of them whether you admit it or not." He slept that night in a bed that had a lump and loved it. He woke to the noisy negotiations of a young settlement learning when hammers should be employed. He considered living there full time. He considered visiting the bunker only out of sentiment, like returning to an old school to see whether the lockers had shrunk or if you had grown. He did not decide that day. He walked in the morning and returned by lunch and sat on a low wall watching Lyra argue with a vine that then apologized by producing 3 green things that might one day be edible. He listened to people plan the foolish projects that hold civilizations together. A bridge here. A library there. An event where everyone who could cook would cook something terrible and call it traditional, until someone who actually knew would fix the recipe. He had never been better in his life. And yet when the radio coughed the certain cough that a particular kind of emergency makes, he stood before he finished standing. He went because people like him know at some cellular level that quiet is not a possession but a lease. Sale did not stop him. She did not sigh. She pressed her temple to his cheek in the ritual of her people and said, "Come home the long way. It is the only way you know." He did what he has always done, showed up. He stood where a man was required. He made a mess of the plans of those who would turn places into statistics. He was not unique. On that day, 5 other people like him did the same in rooms where he was a rumor. They never met, they never will. They said each other's names wrong when telling the stories later, and the errors knit the world tighter. There was a day, much later, when he sat with Lyra on the bunker's steps, the doors thrown open like a laugh. She was taller than her mother now and had learned to talk to machines as if they were elder sisters. "Did you ever think you would be anything other than cold and stubborn?" she asked with the cruel affection of youth. "I still am," he said, "but sometimes I am warm and stubborn. It's less impressive and more useful." She smiled out at a horizon that had learned new tricks. "You could have traded me," she said. It wasn't a wound now. It was a fact that had grown into a seed. "My mother offered. People do what they can when the night is big." "I could not," he said. "It would have made something in me too comfortable with the next bargain. By the third, I would not have remembered how to stop." She nodded. "We tell that part," she said. "We always do." He closed his eyes, and for a moment the bunker hummed in his bones like a big animal asleep. He saw 100 other rooms where people were doing the small, dull work of keeping a future from collapsing, repairing hinges, mending blankets, checking on the quiet old man in the corner who had not asked for tea but would say yes if offered. He thought, empires always want to talk about the moment of the trumpet. They never make songs about the day a woman fixed a pump before it failed. He spoke low, not as moral or lecture, but as weather report. "It is not that we do not conquer, we can. God knows we've shown it. It's that whatever flag we plant rots if we do not tend the ground the next day, and the next, and the next. It is the tending that makes the flag worth a damn." "And the blanket?" she asked. "That was tending too," he said. "In a hurry." The ash no longer fell every day. Sometimes it snowed real snow as if the sky had forgiven itself a little. Children made angels in it, which is a strange ritual when you think about it, putting your back on a cold world and insisting on leaving a mark that implies grace. Elias watched them and let his heart lean. He was not a religious man in any cathedral sense. But the way a fire catches in a room when someone walks in carrying a loaf of bread is its own kind of proof. Years later, traders who had never owned a uniform landed in a market that had chosen to call itself Lintown because someone had found the word funny and told a story they had overheard in the halls of a ship. They said, "In a dead city, a woman offered a man her child for warmth, and the man gave warmth instead and did not ask for thanks." They said, "Empires do not understand that trade." They said, "Empires are not designed for thanks." They said, "That is why they add up their victories and cannot convert them into dinners." No one wrote that last line on a wall. It lived anyhow. When Elias was old enough to be discounted by the sort of people who mistake smooth skin for relevance, he let the settlement convince him that the bunker could be a museum, and the museum could be kept by someone who had the patience to tell children how the world used to sound when it hated itself. He used fewer words. He used more pauses. He hung the blanket, or rather a blanket, because the original had learned too many bodies to die, and let small hands touch it gently and watch their faces change. Under that blanket he kept a sentence he had written out so many times it had learned to write itself in different handwriting depending on the age of the reader. He did not need to teach it anymore. On field trips, Lyra, now Lyra of the workshop, Lyra of the badly sung songs, stood under it with a smuggled cookie and got crumbs absolutely everywhere and dared anyone to correct her. He corrected her in front of the crowd with a thought and in private by stealing half her cookie. They both considered this justice. There would be other wars. There always are. The shape of them would change because people had been changed by this one. The timing would be argued because arguments are the cleanest kind of power until someone hugs you. Elias did not prepare for them by stockpiling weapons in secret. He prepared for them by helping assign beds to newcomers in ways that made neighbors from strangers. He prepared for them by identifying which cupboards were always empty because someone was too proud to fill out the form and quietly filling them anyway. When the fleet asked him to advise, he came and said, "Spend more on blankets than on speeches," and irritated at least 3 people whose job it was to make speeches. He slept well that night anyway. In the garden behind the museum, a vine that had changed its mind about the validity of this climate grew arrogant on trellis and delivered fruits like apologies. He sat beneath it sometimes and let the shade argue him into a nap. He dreamed when he did of hands, that's all. Hands passing things, cups, tools, a brand new baby, a brand new plan to other hands, a small civilization of palms. He woke one afternoon to the sound of a storm starting to make decisions over the plains, and for the first time since the bunker doors had learned to close, he did not think of where to put people so that the storm's decisions would be less important. He thought of how beautiful the glass would look again. He thought, this is what survival buys you, time to consider aesthetics. He closed the museum early and walked to the hill where the settlement had planted the first row of trees that had genuinely meant it. Wind made a low note in the leaves. The air did not yet smell like rain. It smelled like the possibility of rain, which is a separate perfume entirely. He looked back at the town and saw shirts on a line decide to fight the wind and then dance with it. He saw children racing a dog. He saw an old man falling asleep on a bench because the sermon he had been given did not contradict the nap he intended to have. He watched the sky choose. He felt how his body had decided to stay. Empires in far rooms made plans in those years and after. They drew lines and renamed stars and declared and declared and declared. People who had learned to take blankets from their shoulders and put them on someone else paid most of that no mind. They did not conquer. They conquered the urge to conquer. They did not worship endurance. They did endurance like any other domestic chore. In doing so, they made a world too thick with small alliances for any flag to tear easily. Elias never became a statue. He became a man whose name was said just slightly too often while stirring soup. It is the greatest honor a species like his can give one of its own. On a day when the vines out back had decided to dream big, He walked again to the door of the bunker and put his hand to the concrete beside the line he had written all those years ago. The surface had worn smooth around the letters where the oil from visitors' fingers had spoken with it. He did not plan to write another line. The space had taken on the dignity of a completed thought. He simply held the stone. It was warm where the sun had won its argument. It held him back, the way an old friend does when it knows you want to leave and wants to choose the moment for you. A child behind him, someone else's Lyra, read the words in a careful voice. No one survives alone. The child looked at him as children do when trying to decide if rules apply. Is that true still? It will be true as long as there are nights, he said. And there will be nights for as long as we have skies. The storm reached the town then with a first slap of wet across the lip of a roof. Someone who had left washing out swore without malice. People laughed and ran and gathered what needed gathering. Others stayed and got rained on and called it living. Elias stood and felt the rain on his face and let the sky have its way. He imagined the ships out there turning their noses into heavy weather and loving it. He imagined sail somewhere under another canvas cursing the drip and smiling anyway. He imagined a room on a ship in a future that would not contain him, where someone would tell a story badly and everyone would be grateful just the same. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.